Hopefully with all this, you will find it worthwhile to spend your time in this class. I am the policymaker here. I have decided how to set things like grades and how difficult the exams are and all that sort of stuff because I want you to learn this stuff. That's my goal. So how can I make it in your interest to spend time on this, right? You're not gonna learn any of it just sort of passively accepting everything, right? You got to actually put some effort in. So how can I incentivize you to put a little bit of effort in? That's why we have things like homework, by the way. It's not like, to punish you. It's because you actually learn things by doing them. And so by putting in a little bit of effort, it makes you more likely to, retain information. Anyway, so I've been talking a lot in generalities. Let's get a little bit more specific. Hopefully give you a little bit something more concrete to hold on to. So let's talk about a single problem that has been addressed by the use of economic thinking. So, I moved the slides. I did not move the lead in. All right, we'll come back. We'll come back to those slides. Move to leave it. Okay, so pollution. Here's the problem. We put a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. It's an issue. So we don't like it because it creates a more polluted world, which has negative consequences for a number of reasons. And so it's tempting to think of this as just sort of something that happens. But it is a choice. It is a choice that somebody has made to choose to pollute. And, that's just what it is, right? If nobody made that choice, it wouldn't happen. And yet people have made that choice. So the reasonable question to think of is, well, why? Why are they doing that? If you want them to stop, you sort of have to ask that question because otherwise you won't understand why they're doing it in the first place. So they have a trade-off here, right? They have a choice to make. And when they're making that decision, they have a couple different things that they're looking at. They could, let's say that you're running a factory, right? And you can choose to construct your factory in such a way that pollutes more or pollutes less. Okay. So what are the incentives that are in front of you as a factory builder or owner, right? Well, if you pollute more, that's probably cheaper. You can offer lower cost goods, which, for you means you're probably going to have more sales and more profit. From a broader perspective, it could lead to a stronger economy in the short run. As people have more stuff, it raises the standard of living. People are better off because they have more stuff. So those are the incentives that are there if you pollute more. Right? If you pollute more, then you get all these things. But if you pollute less, well, if you pollute less, then there's less damage to the environment. There's more resources available in the long run. In the short run, it could be a weaker economy. But again, these are the incentives that are available to you, right? So let's imagine that, let's say you're not the factory owner, but you want factory owners to pollute less, right? So how would an economist think about making that happen? Well, you would want to change the incentives, right? If you can change the incentives such that they would choose not to pollute as much, right? Then they're going to choose not to pollute as much. So if you add an additional incentive for not polluting, that's going to shift more people to make the choice to not pollute on their own, right? This is called the incentive principle. I'm gonna write it down. Incentive principle. Ooh, where's my thing? There you go. Can't see anything. There it is. The incentive principle. Hey, there we go. We got there. We underlined it. So the incentive principle says is that a person is going to be more likely to take an action if the benefit rises and less likely to take it if the costs rise. In short, incentives matter. Now, this is not rocket science, right? This is pretty straightforward stuff. This is pretty common sense. I promise you that there is a reason why we're starting from such basic levels, right? But this is what the whole course is built on. This idea that people are going to follow incentives to some degree or another, right? That if you make something look more attractive, then more people are going to do it. If you make something look less attractive, fewer people are going to do it. And this is a very simple and straightforward idea, but it turns out you can build on it a whole lot because it makes us think about a couple of different things, right? If that's the sort of idea that we have, right? People are making a decision of some sort. It could be about pollution. It could be about anything really. And we want to understand why they're doing it and perhaps how to shift what their decision is. We need to think about why they're making the decision, right? What are the inputs to their decision that they're making and how can those things be shifted around? Because it might just make them choose differently. So economics is the study of this whole process. It's the study of how we respond to incentives and trade-offs. So how do we make choices? What motivates us to make those particular choices? So what are incentives and trade-offs? And I do apologize. A lot of today is going to be these very basic common sense definitions, and I do promise that we're going to be going somewhere with them. So an incentive is something that you get for taking a particular action or making a particular choice. That's it. So for a very simple example, there's a homework, there's a participation assignment that's, there's a homework that's due on the 3rd. October 3rd, there's a homework due. If you do this homework, you'll be rewarded with points, which will make it easier to pass the class. Also, you'll become a tiny bit smarter. If you don't do the homework, however, you will have extra time to do whatever you want. You could watch Netflix, you could walk around, you could look on your phone, you could do whatever. And that is a real choice that you have to make, right? We can come in here and, tell the lie that I can make you do your homework, but I can't. I can't make you do anything. All I can do is incentivize you, right? I've made it in your interest, hopefully, to do the homework because I have the ability to fail you. I could if you don't do it. If you don't do enough of the stuff, then yeah, you'll fail this class. But that's not the same as making you do it. I can't make you do it. All I can do is provide incentives that make it in your interest to do the homework, right? So in this homework situation, right, we have a trade-off. There is a trade-off. A trade-off is whenever you make a decision to do something, you are giving up all the incentives associated with the option that you did not take. If you ever hear the phrase, there's no such thing as a free lunch, this is what it means. Even if someone is literally offering you a lunch at no cost, you're eating that lunch instead of some other lunch, right? There's always something that you're giving up. There's always an alternative that you could have had instead that you are not having, which means that trade-offs are all over the place. And so you have to understand what goes into those trade-offs, or what are the incentives on each side of the options, and how can you figure out what people are going to do. And as the policymaker here, how can I set it up such that it's in your interest to actually do the homework, right? If, for example, I'd made the homework worth 0.1% of your grade, right, then it wouldn't really make it easier for you to pass the class if you did it, right? It wouldn't really matter. But it still might make you a bit smarter. So some of you would choose to do the homework anyway, just out of the interest of doing well in the class, or in anticipation that the homework would make you do better on the exams. But it would have removed an incentive for you to do the homework. And probably some of you at that point would have chosen not to do it, who otherwise would have with the higher grade, right? And so coming into the class, I need to think about how to shape those incentives to get you to do what I want you to do, which is to do the homework. If you're in a business and you're trying to get people to buy your stuff, you got to figure out what the price is going to be. You got to figure out how difficult it's going to be to buy, right? Why does everybody sell their stuff on Amazon? Because it makes it really easy for their consumers to buy it, right? Amazon takes their cut, right? And you don't want that, but you're willing to do it because it makes it more in your consumer's interest to make the trade-off of buying your thing as opposed to somebody else's thing, which might be easier to come by. So, these trade-offs are what people are thinking about all the time when they're deciding how to set up incentives, right? How can you make it so that it's in somebody's interest to do the thing that you want them to do? And how can we just understand what it is that they're doing in the first place, right? How do people choose? How do you weigh all those incentives that are involved, right? How do you decide whether, the time that it takes you to search at a different store other than Amazon, is that worth more or less than $1 off the price of maybe being able to find it cheaper somewhere else? That one of those things is $1. The other thing is time. How do you convert those two things? How do you compare them? So how do you weigh up those incentives involved? How do you process the information that comes with it? You don't know if you're going to find it cheaper somewhere else if you go to shop somewhere else. How do you consider the opinions of others, right? How does this all work out in a social network situation? How should some sort of policymaker design the system such that you're going to get the best outcomes, right? So these sorts of trade-off designs are happening all the time, whether you intend them to or not. All right, I'll break there for questions again, and also because I need some water. Can someone say something just to confirm for me that we are all in fact here?
We are all here.
Hey, okay, all right, thank you. Okay. All right. Okay, so coming back to the pollution example, right? We said there's the trade-off. You have a choice of how much to pollute, right? And so how do you change the behavior? Well, you change the incentive. That's what an economist would say. One of the ways that you can do that is a carbon tax. This was done in British Columbia in 2008. And this changes the incentives surrounding pollution, right? So everything stays the same, right? We had all those incentives for polluting more, lower cost goods, stronger economy, blah, 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 polluting less, less damage to the environment, which, by the way, some of these things, some of these incentives are not directly, they're indirect relative to the person who's actually making the decision, right? If you're making the decision now about how much to pollute, the people who are really going to get the benefits of polluting less are your, descendants, your children or grandchildren. That might not weigh as heavily into your decision-making process, right? Because it's far off in the future. But now adding in the carbon tax, which is basically a tax on how much carbon you emit into the atmosphere, adds a new incentive on the side of polluting less. If you pollute less, you get to avoid the carbon tax, which should change the balance of the incentives, right? Should you pollute more? Should you pollute less? Which one is better for you, right? As an individual decision maker. Well, if it was equal before, or maybe tilted a little bit in the polluting more direction, add a little bit more weight over here. You get to avoid the carbon tax. It's not going to make everybody stop polluting, but it might make people pollute less, might make some people pollute less. And that's what it's intended to do, right? It changes the incentives, which changes the trade-off, which makes some people switch from one side of the decision to the other. So we can see what happened in the case of British Columbia. So this is data on carbon emissions in British Columbia and the rest of Canada in the lead up to the carbon tax and then afterwards. So you can see before the carbon tax went into place, British Columbia was already polluting less than Canada, the rest of Canada. But it sort of followed along in a similar path, right? Canada goes down, British Columbia goes down. Canada goes up, British Columbia goes up. There's sort of the gap between them stays the same. Then carbon tax goes into effect, and you can see that Canada continues along its merry way, nothing really changing, but British Columbia starts to drop, right? So whereas before it was pretty flat, nothing really changing about its carbon emissions, carbon tax goes into effect, the incentive for not polluting gets stronger. People will then choose to pollute less so as to follow these incentives, and you see carbon emissions beginning to drop. This is exactly the way that an economist would approach how to get people to behave in a different way, change the incentives that are associated with the decision that you are making. And at least in this particular instance, that seemed to have the intended effect of getting people to choose the option that we are incentivizing. All right, so that's really what economics is about. This is also what separates it from, this is what separates it from business, because we're interested not so much in, how can we, structure our own business operations the best, although some of those things, our choices are important, or some of the economic thinking is important for that. But it also distinguishes it from the other social sciences, and this is a social science. Economists focus on incentives to explain the world. We sort of take the stance that much of what happens in the world, it happens because people make choices about what to do. If you can explain why that choice is happening, you can explain what's going on in the world. And if you can understand the incentives that people face, you can explain what the choices that they're making.